You're good to go.
I guess that's my cue. All right, cool. So this is about replatforming from Cloud Foundry onto OpenShift. And what I'm going to show you is basically some of my experiences with the current customer that I'm on. Some other things are just based on some of my research that we want to do, but are not necessarily doing right now. And hopefully based on this helps kind of plan out some of the improvements to the tooling that's needed and maybe some new features as well. So didn't know if this was necessary. This is part of the template. I'm sure everyone's familiar with what conveyor is. So defining some of the high-level migration steps. So at a very high level, this is kind of what I'm going to take you guys through. So number one is identifying migration candidates to perform application assessment. Next, you're going to migrate PCF orgs and spaces to OpenShift projects. After that, you're going to want to migrate the services that those microservices are dependent on. And then finally, you'll actually migrate those microservices and create a CI/CD pipeline. So we'll kind of, with a fine-tooth comb, step into each of these. So first is identifying the migration candidates. First you have to have the PCF inventory. This can sometimes be a little challenging because, based on the size of their PCF org or instance, they may or may not have a detailed spreadsheet for you to use. Our customer did, and that was very helpful. So that's kind of like the prerequisite here. And then next, you're going to want to categorize and figure out how to prioritize your applications. And so this is a very, very basic way of kind of categorizing this, but just to kind of show you maybe like a three-phase rollout. Phase one could be just simple internal-facing apps with no services bound to it. So maybe like a simple Spring Boot API. You can target that as phase one and say, okay, let's make sure we can roll out, or migrate the most basic use case first and start kind of building some of your tooling and automation around that. And then take an iterative approach. So phase two, okay, now we have one service. Maybe it's MySQL or Postgres or whatever you want to identify as that one service. Start handling that. And then, phase three, maybe it's two or more services, or maybe it's just any public facing application. We want to save that for last when we know that our automation is rock solid. So that's kind of how you can identify migration candidates and, determine which applications that you want to focus on first. Next is performing an application assessment. And this is one of those things that we're not quite doing yet at our customer, but we want to start doing. This is about determining if an application is in a cloud-ready state. So there's a couple of good tools that we can use for that. The first one is Migration Toolkit for Applications. And this is going to basically scan through any Java-based application and determine if it's in a cloud-ready state. And if it's not, it'll assign story points that are required to transform it and get it there. So you can kind of determine the level of effort. Next one, of course, is Tackle. I wasn't sure if it was Conveyor Tackle or if it was Pathfinder, but Tackle Pathfinder looked like it was the name of the GitHub repo. And this is a questionnaire-based assessment tool that you can use to determine the suitability for a enterprise Kubernetes deployment. So these are a couple of the tools that I was aware of there that folks can use for assessments. After that, you want to migrate from your CF org and space to OpenShift projects. And so, once you've determined the applications, you've determined that it is cloud ready. Now you can start taking the team that owns those applications. You can start migrating that team's orgs and spaces to OpenShift. So at a very high level, in case folks aren't familiar, how Cloud Foundry is organized. At a very high level, you have an org, and then you have spaces, and then in each space you have applications. So it's a very logical way to kind of hierarchically break down where apps are going in Cloud Foundry. And based on that, you can say, okay, let's say that I have an org. Let's just call it, my org, two spaces. Kind of boring names, but before that's in Cloud Foundry, how are we going to move that into OpenShift? And you kind of have to take this as a case-by-case basis. There's probably no cut and dry rule here, but you could create just one project called My Org, and everything that was in those spaces and those applications could all go in the same project. Maybe you break it down into separate projects. So you say My Org dash, and then the space name, so space one, space two, the respective apps go in those projects. Or maybe the org is just really, really large, and it makes sense to just give them their own cluster. So there's a couple ways to do that. As far as I know, there's not a great migration tool for doing something like this. This is, I think, something that our customer, we're just kind of handling as on a case-by-case basis, and we have some custom automation built around t-shirt sizing, configuring RBAC, and creating the namespaces, whatnot. So after all of that is done, they have a project in OpenShift. Now you want to think about service migration. So at a very high level, what this will look like, you'll deploy the new service instance, migrate that data over from old to new, and then you'll save the credentials to somewhere accessible to OpenShift so that the apps can authenticate. So getting started, you may have a lot of work to do with this, or you may not have much work to do at all. And that it depends on if the service is inside or outside of Cloud Foundry. If it's running inside of Cloud Foundry, then of course we're going to want to move that out. We can consider moving it into OpenShift. We can consider maybe moving it to some cloud service. If we are going to move it to OpenShift, consider using an operator. That would probably be the best practice to actually operate on that service and keep it running. If the service is already outside of Cloud Foundry, then this might actually be really good news. You may be able to just keep the service where it is and just ensure that your apps can connect from OpenShift. If you're allowed to open up a firewall, you can just keep the service where it is. That would probably be the best case scenario there. As far as data migration goes, this is probably the whole presentation on its own. I just kind of listed some tools that I'm aware of here. If you're moving from something like a MySQL to a Postgres, you could use something like PG Loader. You could probably do Postgres to Postgres as well with that. Maybe you're in Cloud Foundry right now and you actually want to use AWS RDS. They have a really slick tool you can use for that. And then of course, just native backup and restore procedures. Postgres, MySQL, all the major databases, they all have their own backup and restore procedures and scripts that you can use after you have the new instance created. As far as secrets management goes, I think that saving credentials to OpenShift is OpenShift secrets is a fine MVP. It's very simple from there to load those as environment variables or to mount them however the application needs. As a day two, if the customer has a secrets management engine like Vault, that's probably the better long-term solution. Depending on the barrier to entry, maybe you're able to just do that from the get-go. In our particular case, there were quite a few hurdles to jump through to get them there. So as a kind of intermediate step, we're saving them the secrets. Other solutions like sealed secrets are really good too. And this is a solution that encrypts the secret data and actually encrypts the YAML as well. So you can actually check this into Git, and it's really a pretty sound solution for GitOps-based solutions. So once you've handled the service, now we focus on actually migrating the applications. So this is where you're going to build and deploy the app to OpenShift, configure the service binding details, kind of hit on a little bit, but we'll hit on a little bit more, and then create the CI/CD pipeline so we can automate our builds and deploys better. So at a very high level, a Cloud Foundry application has a manifest.yaml file, and this is how in the PCF world they do configuration as code. I actually have an example of what a manifest file looks like on a later slide, but at a high level, it'll give you, the application name, number of instances, environment variables, all the details that we need or that Cloud Foundry needs to build and deploy the application. And the good news is that a lot of this is directly maps to OpenShift. We can actually create our deployments and services, run ingress, config map, any other resources that we need there based on what's in the manifest file. So that's really great. And the custom automation that we're writing with my customer, I'll hit on that towards the end of the presentation, but it's relying on this manifest file as one input. And this gives you almost everything that you need to create those OpenShift resources. In the Cloud Foundry side, they use build packs to configure and build applications. So simple example here, if a user has a Java application, the user can run cf push That's pretty much the command that you run in Cloud Foundry to build and deploy an application. CF push is going to refer to the manifest file as far as what build pack that it needs, and then it's going to build and actually deploy that app into Cloud Foundry. And this is a very similar process to what OpenShift has natively with S2I. So with our customer, what we're doing is, if they're using a Java build pack, we're using our Java S2I image, which is almost, it's a fork of the Red Hat S2I image, essentially, with some customer specific information added to that. And, yeah.
Hey, it's James, just a quick question, because we're trying to, so like on the conveyor side, we're trying to be focused more on like Kubernetes and the CNCF stuff, like projects, but so like S2I doesn't exist in those areas. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around, like, is there another solution, like if someone's just purely using upstream?
Sure, you could probably focus on cloud native build packs, and the reason I didn't mention that here is because I myself have not used cloud native build packs, so I can't confirm if it is similar to the Cloud Foundry build packs or not. But I know that it is branched off of the CF build packs projects, and so I'm sure that it would work.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. I think I hit on everything I wanted to there. Yeah. So based on the CF build pack, you can use something like S2I or cloud native build packs or another solution to essentially replicate what's happening there in CF. As far as service binding goes, so this is where it gets a little interesting. And this is where the manifest.yaml file starts to kind of, that's where you start to realize you can't focus only on the manifest file. What happens in Cloud Foundry when you deploy an app that has a service binding, it's going to automatically create an environment variable called vcap services. And there's an obvious reason why this isn't included in the manifest file. It's because the vcap services contains your actual service binding credentials. And this is something that your application reads as an environment variable, and then what you'll see in most Cloud Foundry apps is it's actually parsing through this vcap services. And so what you'll see in an application.properties file on the bottom right would be something like spring.datasource.url, and actually using dot notation to kind of parse through that vcap services. Other times what you'll see is in the Java code, you'll see them actually consume it that way and create a data source in code. And then another thing you'll see is Cloud Foundry can do something called auto reconfiguration. And this is where if the app doesn't actually define any data sources, then Cloud Foundry will actually just give you a data source. It'll automatically create one for you. So, and it does this all with the vcap services environment variable. So one easy thing that you can do when migrating applications that have service bindings, but this would probably be the lowest common denominator, would be to just export that vcap services variable in Cloud Foundry into an OpenShift secret or into Vault, and then have the application consume that. That would be the zero code change, zero config change approach there. You probably want to get them away from that if you can. And I think we get into this on this slide here. I recommend if you can get them away from that vcap services and just focus on moving the URL, the username, and the password somewhere so that you can eliminate that vcap services reference and just say something like URI username password. But in our particular case, we're in a situation where we're unable to actually move those services first. Moving the services first is a better approach, but in our particular case, we can't. And so what we're doing right now for apps that fall into that bucket is we are just moving the vcap services into a secret so that they can continue to talk to the old service binding. And then once we move that service over, we're going to follow an approach like this, which is where we drop the vcap services references, only pick and choose the configs that we need to kind of set them on that Kubernetes native path. One thing that I wanted to hit on, because this is a popular solution and this is something that we want to move towards with our customer, is saving credentials in Vault. And a common concern is, well, if it's in Vault, how are we going to load those into OpenShift? The Vault CLI has a subcommand called agent, so you'll hear it commonly referred to as Vault agent. And this is something that you can run in an init container or a sidecar. And what this will do is it will load in the secrets onto a file that you can template out in the console template. And so an example of that is on the right. You can say, maybe your secrets path is called like secret my app config. You can load in the secrets from that path into something like an application properties formatted file. That'll create that into a mount path. And then your application can refer to that. So that's kind of that's the solution that we're working towards with our customer that we want to use for service bindings. So we talked a lot about some of the high level steps. We haven't talked a lot about automation yet. And so I want to kind of spend the end of the presentation talking about how you can automate a lot of the steps that we've talked about, specifically around application migration. So one of the first things that you want to do is identify the tooling that you want to use to help accelerate the effort. And so, of course, I'm sure everyone is familiar with Move to Kube. And this is a really awesome tool. It can look at the manifest file, the PCF environment, and convert that into raw Kubernetes manifest or a Helm chart. There's a lot of different possibilities there that you can use. This is the part where maybe some people's eyes will roll here. So while I think that Kubernetes, or while I think that Move to Kube is a great tool, we were in a situation where we thought that our customers' integrations were too complex to fit in with the prescribed approach that Move to Kube used. So we ended up writing our own custom automation and not using Move to Kube. My standpoint on it right now is that I think that Move to Kube is excellent for newer OpenShift or Kubernetes users who don't have their own defined workflows created yet. So, for example, my customer uses Helm very, very heavily. They have their own Helm charts, they have their own enterprise Helm charts, a Spring Boot chart, a Node.js chart, and that's how users are deploying onto OpenShift. So, it's hard to expect a tool that's not created in-house to convert manifest file contents and PCF contents into the Helm values that they need for their specific Helm charts, right? So that's why we didn't use Move to Kube. I do think it's a great tool for those, more greenfield initiatives, however. So writing custom automation. So this kind of gets to a little bit what I was saying. Every OpenShift environment is unique. Don't hesitate to write custom automation. When you write your custom automation, you're going to want to read from the Cloud Foundry space and the manifest file. The reason is because there are things in CF that won't be present in the manifest, like the VCAP services. You can take those and convert it into OpenShift resources. Very similar to what Move to Kube is doing. Again, it's just more customized. It's more custom tailored to whatever the particular use cases that you're trying to handle. And I always recommend a Golang CLI. There's some great Go libraries there, such as Cobra, that can really accelerate the effort there. And then, you're going to want to probably generate for them a skeleton CI/CD pipeline as well. And this is something that is also highly, highly customized based on the customer. I wouldn't really expect like a tool like Move to Kube or some upstream tool to be able to generate this, because you don't know what CI/CD tool you're using. You don't know, how they work, like kind of what their standard workflow is, so to speak. So, but you're going to want to generate for them some kind of a skeleton pipeline. And so this could be something like, log into OpenShift or Kubernetes, build your application, then build your image, and then deploy it, right? And kind of use the high level steps, whether it's OC commands or whatever other tool is being leveraged with the customer, kind of just plug those in, and then, leave some room in there for them to add their own details that were maybe in their Cloud Foundry pipeline. So that's been our approach there. And to kind of summarize it all in a picture, this is what that automation would look like. So as inputs, you take the Cloud Foundry environment and the manifest file. We call it Migration Factory. Take the Migration Factory CLI, and then as an output, you'll have the Helm values for our particular customer. Ours was Helm values for building and deploying using enterprise Helm charts. This could instead be a Kubernetes manifest, or maybe just a Helm chart on its own. You create the skeleton Jenkins file, and then you'll create the OpenShift secret, in our case, with those service binding credentials. So obviously there's lots of room for customization here based on use case, but this is the approach we're using at our customer. And then I want to just hit really on just some very high level details here as far as our customer goes. So we're working with a financial institution with primarily Spring Boot applications, and their services include MariaDB, Postgres, and RabbitMQ. Those are the most common anyways. As far as the current state goes, we're currently able to take our automation and migrate apps with no service binding, so basic Spring Boot APIs. We can also migrate apps that are bound to an external service. Our automation and just teams are not yet aligned to the point where we're ready to migrate the services completely. So that's why we're not able to use automation to move the service, migrate data over, et cetera. We can handle those first two use cases. The migration automation is being developed iteratively. So the way that it's working is we're essentially distributing the tool to teams that we've identified in that kind of phase 1 and phase 2 that I was talking about at the beginning, kind of the easy and medium level applications. And we're just getting feedback essentially. So sometimes the tool works, but maybe it's a little clunky. So we take that feedback and improve it. Sometimes it crashes and doesn't work, and so we take that as feedback and improve it. The iterative nature of this is very important to being successful. And then finally, like I was talking about, the service migration automation has not yet been developed. And then finally, just some very high-level challenges here are the custom integrations. We want to get them saving credentials in Vault. Many applications already are. They do have static secrets involved, so we need to figure out how is our automation going to easily configure those details. They do use Helm. They have a set of what I like to call enterprise Helm chart or enterprise Helm charts, and so instead of writing a Helm chart from scratch, they just create a Helm values file and then Helm install against the enterprise Helm chart. So one Helm chart services many applications. So our tooling needs to convert the CF environment and the manifest file into the Helm values. And then finally, I don't know if this is really a challenge, but just a detail is that they have their own set of enterprise container images, like many enterprises do. So we just need to make sure that we're plugging those into the config, where it's necessary. And then just like the sheer amount of apps that we're moving, there's about 3,000, I should say, microservices. And so that's why this iteratively developing automation, improving our process so that we can just distribute it across the enterprise. That's why that's very important. It's going to be very hard to do that by hand. And then finally, just identifying the applications and getting buy-in is hard. And this isn't something that I've seen firsthand. I've been more focused on developing the actual automation, but I know that it's been difficult trying to teams are comfortable in CF and trying to get them to move over and have those conversations is tricky. So that's pretty much it. That's what I wanted to share. Those are some of the high level steps that I wanted to walk through, and interested in your guys' feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. I guess I'll open it up. I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions.
Hey, Austin, it's a question, but it's also a request, which is we have a Move to Cube planning session on Thursday, where actually some of these things around customization of target artifacts and so on is specifically what the team is working on now. So we'd really love to have you on that session to poke at what we are proposing and say, why it would work or wouldn't work in the kinds of scenarios you've seen. Really appreciate if you can join us.
Yeah, I would love to join that. My email is on this slide here. I don't know if you want to just shoot me an invite or not, but that'd be great. I'll be there.
Awesome.
Thanks, Austin. These are all really good feedback, and it'll really help us to improve the toolings in general. And Paige, actually, a related question on this. I want to invite a couple of folks over for this planning session. Is there quick link or something we can send across where they can click and get an invite, or should it be some custom invite?
Was that a question for me or for James? That sounded like.
I think that's more for Paige. But what's the best way to get people invited?
Yeah, just let me know who, and I will get it to them. If you need an easier way to just share a link, then let me know which sessions, and I can get you those too.
Sure, Paige. Thank you.
Yeah, what comes to mind from your story is the amount of customization, like based on the specific of one customer versus what can be standardized across multiple customers. Like, what's your take on this? What would be the easiest thing to standardize versus, like, it feels like there's a lot of customization, but is there some easy thing that you see would be the same problem across multiple customers?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's a difficult question. I think that the way I would approach it is, I think the reason why I mentioned Greenfield for move to Cube or teams that don't have a workflow yet is because if you introduce this team or this tool early on, whatever the prescriptive approach is, whether it's move to Cube in its current state or in a later state, the sooner that you introduce that, the sooner that team can adapt their workflow around that prescriptive approach. And so our problem is that, we had our home charts and we had, Vault, and we had a lot of other custom integrations that were core to the developer experience with that user that moved to Cube. We would have had to really backtrack what it was doing in order to mold it around that experience. And so I think my answer to your question is, we can get into some of the customizations that we should allow for, but at the end of the day, the sooner that this tool is available and is introduced to customers that are moving off of Cloud Foundry, the better, so that they can start to mold their experience around it. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I know this was a tricky question. I'm just processing all the information you gave us. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
And Austin, what was your experience around moving developers? I know you said it was kind of tricky to choose the apps and convince them, but can you talk about the work or the legwork needed around getting developers moved over? The experience?
Yeah, so one very core thing that I should have mentioned here, but I left out is training. I would say training, I'm trying to think of the workflow that I presented you. There would be, move from your PCF org and space into OpenShift, and then right in between moving into OpenShift and migrating services and apps would be training. And so this would be, whether it's just, Red Hat OpenShift training provided by Red Hat, maybe your enterprise actually has some demos and content that folks can use before they start developing. But there has to be some kind of enablement there before the migration, because, worst case, what happens, maybe the automation is just rock solid. It moves everything over. The developer has to know now how to carry the torch, right? How to continue to operate and develop. So that the training is very important.
So one idea we've been throwing around, right, is that it doesn't address everything, right? But if you're a developer who knows how to get things done around CF, now let's say your teams move to OpenShift, does it help to have like a cheat sheet or a reference which says, how do I do this in OpenShift? I mean, do you think tools like that would help automate the developer experience migration?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I push a lot at our customers is having a knowledge base, having support and conversations public, so that when someone asks, how do I do X, Y, and Z, that initial problem will be a conversation. But now what people can do is they can search whatever tooling it is. We use GitHub Issues. They can now search it and find that information out. But something like a cheat sheet or whatever form that comes in would be very helpful. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Hey, another question would be, sorry, I should go ahead. Go ahead first.
It's okay, Marco, please go ahead.
I was just curious to know, like, how you haven't talked much about how that customers was promoting apps, for example, from dev to QE to production, either on CF or OpenShift. From that perspective, like, what were they doing from a CI/CD pipeline point of view, or promoting apps from one environment to another on CF, and how this got impacted when migrating to Kubernetes? Like, you talk about the technology side, Helm and so on, but I'm just curious, like, from a process point of view, what changed or didn't change?
Mm-hmm. So as far as my experience goes with this, we haven't moved any of the applications over into production yet. They're all in dev on the OpenShift side. I know that on the PCF side, they have different Jenkins files targeting different, clusters, PCF instances. Not sure what the right terminology would be on that side, but so we plan to do the same thing on the OpenShift side. The way that they work, and this isn't the way that I recommend, but this is the way that they're working, is that they have one cluster and they're using different namespaces for different environments. It's one approach that you can use, but they'll have like a dev QA for their non-prod cluster, and then in their prod cluster they would have their namespace there. And so we're planning on following a similar approach. I just don't have, I guess, the first-hand experience to tell you how it's going, because we're not that far there yet. So.
But is the interest was then to try to move to like a CI/CD? Like, is the interest, you think, in general is mostly just to move apps, or it's actually to move apps in some kind of CI/CD process that will help them do this promotion later on when they're ready? Like, and even just not specifically about this customer, but in general, like, is that a good assumption to think that what they need is to add up some kind of automation or CI/CD process so that they can actually promote, instead of just migrating the apps? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Right. In my opinion, a migration is having that CI/CD pipeline available so that they have the automation to, like I said, carry the torch. Right now they have the automation to build and deploy, and the training comes into play so that they understand how that's actually working. So what the automation would do is it would create a skeleton Jenkins file for them with all the bare minimum steps. Mm-hmm. But it's very, very difficult to have all of those little customizations from their CF pipeline in that OpenShift one. So, we're making it very clear to our users that this is the bare minimum Jenkins file. Now you can move over what you were doing in CF into that pipeline. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
I had a question, Austin. Thank you for the presentation too, by the way. It was great. The very first step that you mentioned was, getting an overview of their whole environment and deciding what applications were good candidates for migration. What are they using to get that overall view of what they have? Is there some sort of tool or database, or?
I will find the tool and I'll put it in the doc. I'll find it. There is a tool that they're using. It's running some kind of a script and creating a spreadsheet. So I'll find it.
I'll put it on Slack, Vince. I have it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. For this specific user flow, was there some Netflix OSs or some kind of environment like CF middlewares kind of stuff which needs to be migrated to, let's say, constructs?
I don't think I heard what you said there. Were there some CF what that needs to be migrated?
Like, for example, Netflix OSs artifacts, like, for example, Zool, ribbons, panes, and stuff that needs to be migrated to Kubernetes native artifacts.
We haven't had to do that yet. Trying to debate on if that's going to be actually a step or not, because a lot of what you can do with the Netflix stack is baked into Kubernetes native, right? Load balancing and services, and you have ingress and routes on the OpenShift side as well. As far as service discovery, headless services. So we're not quite there yet to the point where we've had to focus on migrating any of that. But I think when we get there, our approach is going to be to see, can we just use native Kubernetes and OpenShift to do that?
Sure. Yeah, and that's exactly the challenge where we have to understand this particular configurations. If the customer was using Zool, let's say in the source, how do you understand the configuration and convert to ingress or root? Right. Okay. And the second question is around the dev experience. In a Cloud Foundry world, like when you talk to customers, what kind of developer experience do they really have? Like, is it still the same as what they generally have in OpenShift, like check it into Git repository, forget about it, things get into the pipeline and run? Or do anyone actually really do CF push and get the benefit of that?
So one of the good things about CF that I've really appreciated is that they also push, well, they appear to, I guess I won't speak for them as a project, but they appear to also push 12-factor and GitOps and a lot of the same things that, we push on the Kubernetes and OpenShift side. So it has been really great in that regard. They have, they are using Git. They do appear to be working in a GitOps fashion where they have their manifest file. With everything configured as code when you can, there's still the service bindings on the CF environment. But that seems to be how they're working. And then, in their pipeline, they're using CF push. On the OpenShift side, since they are using Helm very heavily, they're using Helm install. So that's kind of their CF push equivalent. It's been similar, I guess, and that's really worked to our advantage.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments or feedback for Austin, or any other? Well, let me ask you: is there anything that we didn't hear about that you all thought would be helpful to understand? Whether it's user experience design, docs, development, PM, QE.
So James and Austin, this is Shankar here, right? Austin, thanks for this. A great presentation. I will definitely reach out to you after this as well, right? So one of the things that one of the patterns that we have noticed in our migration effort is the usage of Cred Hub and config manager, right? Looking at the manifest YAML, we tried with that approach, but then all we found was a service binding with Cloud Config Server, and everything was being picked up from there, including the credentials, right? So any thoughts on how we can get it from inspecting the PCF environment? Any thoughts on that? Did you face similar patterns?
So Spring Cloud Config Server is one of the upcoming services. I guess I should air quote that services that we plan to handle, because we're seeing the same thing where the VCAP services has the service binding to Cloud Config Server, and that's really where the configuration lies. The teams that are doing that in CF at my customer also want to continue to do that in OpenShift, and so what we're planning to do is literally. And the good thing is that Cloud Config Server, it's just a Spring Boot app essentially. So we're just going to move Config Server into OpenShift. Instead of VCAP services, we'll use like an OpenShift secret to create that service binding. And then, to my knowledge, I think that's all we need to do, because then the actual service binding is in Config Server.
Nice. Okay. Cool. Good. Thanks, Anthos.
Cool. All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. Yeah. Thanks, Austin. Thanks for kind of taking us through and answering some questions. Hopefully, this helps. Hopefully, you're able to join the Move to Cube session later too, to kind of see where they're going and see how we can make sure the tool helps in those user those use cases.
For sure. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thanks. And maybe I could probably hand it back over to Paige. I don't know if you want to stop the recording or how you want to run this, and then maybe take us through our updated agenda, which is going to be fluid this morning.